Hi, everyone. Welcome to this mini lecture on school finance. Public schooling in the United States is funded by taxpayer dollars. So, in this presentation, we'll be looking at government roles in school funding. By roles, I mean the various funding streams and administrative foci at the federal, state, and local levels. But first, let's think back to our work on the purposes of education. Some of the purposes we considered were education as a means to prepare citizens who would make our democracy work. It was also about preparing workers who would make our economy function. And also, it was about education for personal upward social mobility. We read that in a pluralistic society, there may be many ideas about the purpose that education serves. But by sustaining a public education system, it shows that we all agree education plays an important role in our society. Let's consider the federal government's role in education. We have mentioned before that federal level issues involve civil rights, accessibility, and accountability. Therefore, federal dollars are usually tied to one of these big issues. For example, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 aimed to end discrimination by race. Title IX U.S. Code aimed to end discrimination based on gender. Federal dollars are often tied to issues of diversity, discrimination, and access. And then, with No Child Left Behind in 2002, we saw the beginning of what we call the era of accountability, where schools were held accountable for the performance of their students. And this was measured primarily by student test scores. Low performing schools were expected to close the achievement gap. So, in sum, federal dollars allocated to states come with strict regulations on how they may be spent, usually involving one of these big three issues. This brings us to the state level. States, as you may remember from the school structure mini lecture, develop funding formulas which determine how much funding individual districts receive. States also regulate teacher licensure and have an important role in student assessments. And finally, at the local level, we have school boards comprised of elected citizens. These boards govern the use of local tax dollars. Local boards are often involved in districting, which determines which households are part of which school district or which students attend which schools. School districting and financing can be highly contested and often raise diversity and equity concerns. So, we have three sources of public funding in our U.S. education system. In this chart, we see that the average percent of funding from each source going back to 1970. Down in the lower left corner, we can see that federal funding looks to be at about 10% and has held steady across the years. State funding, which has very slowly increased, looks to be about 40 to 45%. And local funding, which started off at about 50%, has slowly decreased and is now about equal to that of the state level. Of course, these three funding streams comprise 100% of what a local district receives at any time, right? What's important to point out here is that all localities are not created equally. Some school districts have a much more economically robust tax base than others. And while there are federal and state programs to offset this inequality, we know that not all districts can offer the same opportunities for all students. The primary source of school funding is state and local governments. So, where you grow up in the United States does, in fact, make a difference in the education you receive. This next figure represents total expenditures per pupil from 1970 through 2015. How these costs were computed has changed over the years. The graph shows the overall trend. Back in 1970, and I'm looking down in the lower left corner, the average cost per pupil in the United States was about $1,000. This might be more like $5,000 in today's computing. Then, 45 years later, in 2015, the average cost per pupil is closer to $11,000. And now I'm looking in the upper right corner. This is many times what it was 45 years ago. And we might speculate some reasons for this increase, including technology and salaries and school safety. But remember that the percent of federal funding has remained relatively stable through the years, so state and local funding has absorbed most of the burden for these increases. I'm pointing this out because it again emphasizes the connection between where students live and the quality of education, at least in terms of expense per pupil, they receive. This next slide shows some of the big expenses in a school budget. First, we have staffing. There has been a need to increase the number of teachers and therefore salaries to reduce teacher student ratios, and also the increase in the number of specialized teachers and other staff needed to serve students with special needs. Moving on, we have support services, which broadly include transportation and food. Next, we have instruction, where there are expenses, of course, for materials, computers, and special programs, and so forth. Administrative and capital expenses include the cost of running those programs, of the buildings and their maintenance. And finally, we have assessments and their increasing importance to school accountability. Most standardized testing requires computers and special software, administration, and oversight. So, this brings us to the question of how to actually fund education in a way that meets all students' needs. We have the concepts here of equality, equity, and adequacy. Equality means providing all schools with the same or equal number of resources, regardless of location. But we know this is problematic because not all locations have the same needs, right? So we look at equity. Equity means to provide what is actually needed. But this is difficult to determine and a bit idealistic. So finally, we have the concept of adequacy, which is a strategy for funding schools to teach the average student to the state standard and then identify how much more is needed to teach students with special needs. Many funding formulas are based on this concept of adequacy. So I'm ending this mini lecture rather abruptly because I want to leave you to explore the content and shape your own ideas about the topic. There is no ideal way to finance schools. The takeaway this week is to increase your knowledge of how education is financed and some of the implications for schools, teachers, and students.